I thought Mark Carney's speech was a stunning speech. I thought it was very impactful, very thoughtful.
It was an excellent speech. It was a deep analysis of the change in the world order.
The great thing about Carney's speech, it was an argument. It was a worldview.
And written by Carney.
I had more leaders from the United States quietly send me, not publicly, not enough standing up publicly, the transcript of that speech saying, wow.
Mark Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum has got a lot of people talking. Not everyone loved it, notably the Trump administration.
We should look at it as just political noise.
Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
I'm Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, we're going to talk about the so-called Carney doctrine. Why has it gotten such a reaction? Two diplomatic heavy hitters give us their take. Then, as a Republican in the Senate, he was a top Trump foe. Former Senator Jeff Flake on the U.S. reaction and whether the Republicans will ever stand up to Trump. And Canada's trade minister. What action will the government take to match Carney's words? Let's begin with Mark Carney's call for strength over subordination. The House is now in session.
Great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact.
At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland this week, Mark Carney offered a warning that the rules-based international order isn't working as advertised and that it's time for middle powers to name reality and work together or risk being overrun by global giants. So, how significant was this speech, and will Canada pay a price for it? We've brought together two former diplomats who've worked together on cross-border issues. Peter Beam is a Canadian senator, former ambassador, and former G7 Sherpa. Tom Shannon was the Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs, the third highest-ranking position at the U.S. State Department. We spoke Friday. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me on The House.
Good to be with you, Catherine.
Thank you very much.
Ambassador Shannon, obviously there was a fair bit of international reaction to this speech, but I wonder concretely, does anybody do anything differently because of what Mark Carney said in that room?
Yes, I think so. Listen, what's striking about the speech for me is not the topic, although it was an important articulation of the circumstances that many countries find themselves in now. What was striking for me is that it was delivered by the Canadian Prime Minister. This is a speech that I would have expected from a Brazilian or an Indian or an Indonesian or someone more clearly identified as a middle power. But historically, we being the United States, have understood North America as a security whole, and Canada and Mexico as part of not just a larger market, but a larger way of facing the world. And to have our closest neighbor, one of our most important trading partners, one of our most important security partners, argue that there's been a rupture in the global order and that Canada now identifies itself as a middle power or as a buffer state, so to speak, between the United States, China, and the rest of the world is quite remarkable. And
sort of the call is coming from inside the House?
Indeed. And it says the house is on fire and run away. And so for me, it's quite striking. And I'm looking for the echo and the resonance from elsewhere in the world, and I expect it.
In what way? What is it that you're looking for?
Well, I think he's articulated very clearly that in order to survive and thrive in the kind of world we're going to be facing over the next several years or even a decade, countries can't go it alone. And those that saw themselves as part of a larger security or commercial project such as in North America, are increasingly understanding that, at least from the point of view of this White House and this president, they're no longer considered part of that. In fact, they might even be considered part of the problem. And therefore, there has to be some degree of cooperation, collaboration among those countries that identify themselves as, in the words of the Prime Minister, middle states.
Senator Beam, you have called this one of the most consequential speeches by a Canadian Prime Minister in decades. But Brian Mulroney announced sanctions on South Africa to try to end apartheid. Jean Chrétien said he would keep Canada out of the war in Iraq. Those speeches described specific actions. What action does Mark Carney need to take in light of this speech?
Well, this is the next step, and I think he has to articulate actions, certainly to Canadians, but to his partners. For all we know, there might be a lot of discussions taking place between leaders, but those two examples that you cited were sort of individual type events and reactions. And I was thinking in some of my earlier studies going back to 1947 when Louis Saint Laurent was not yet Prime Minister, but he was the Secretary of State for External Affairs, and he set out the parameters for Canadian policy in a new world order as it then was. And I would argue that what Mr. Carney has done is put a bookend to that and say, okay, we've had 80 years, and now we're going to have to redefine ourselves because our largest friend, neighbor, partner doesn't really see us in the same way.
Start a new book. Yeah. Ambassador Shannon, clearly this speech angered Trump since he later announced he was officially disinviting Canada from joining his new board of peace and had some less than positive words for the Prime Minister. It's always a risk when any world official speaks out against this president. How big a risk do you think this speech poses for Canada?
Life is full of risks. The question is how you manage them and how you manage the fallout from an event like this. And from my point of view, as an American diplomat, who has treasured the U.S. relationship with Canada and who has sought to expand it and deepen it across all aspects of that relationship, this has been a painful time. The same is true for Mexico. I kind of grew up professionally with a larger idea of North America. But there comes a point when things have to be said. There comes a point when this kind of description is necessary, not only in terms of Canadian politics and the Prime Minister's engagement with his body politic, but also in terms of speaking across our frontier and into the United States and reminding Americans that this is a partnership with a long and important history and that it's at risk. And that the impact of this could be quite harmful. And therefore, I think it was a necessary speech at a necessary moment, independent of the risks.
Nonetheless, in the latter part of this week, we saw Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent making comments that seem to encourage Alberta separatism. And we are looking at the possibility that Alberta will hold a referendum on this issue. How much do you think Canadians need to worry about Trump's administration intentionally dividing this country right now?
Well, listen, I would be stunned if that were a purpose of the Trump administration, simply because once you head down that road, where does it end? And it would be...
You could say that about Venezuela too, though, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it would be an act of political aggression, which I think would be, we haven't seen probably since Benedict Arnold. I just don't see, given the security challenges we face around the world, I don't see why we would attempt to disarticulate such an important partner.
Senator Beam, Mark Carney would have known the stakes in making these comments. Why do you think he went ahead and did it anyway?
I think a number of things. First of all, there's been a lot of talk about having a foreign policy review in our country. We've had them over the years. And what he has done is basically set out the parameters for that. So this is the vision. It's his vision. It's the government's vision. And the mechanics will fall under that. Part of this is trying to rework or reassess our relationship with the United States. It's clear, at least from my vantage point, that our history together doesn't seem to matter as much to the current administration. And I go back, I was in Washington when 9/11 occurred, And we did a lot with the United States. And it's not just Come From Away, which was, of course, a great production, but our work together on a Smart Border Action Plan, our work then with Mexico, it really set a marker. And it seems like all of that has gone away. So it's a bit like a diplomatic gut punch, if you wish.
Ambassador Shannon, it's become in some ways more visceral than that. Also, while in Davos, President Trump was doing an interview with Fox News, and he claimed NATO troops stayed a little back from the front lines in Afghanistan. Not true. He also doubted whether NATO allies would help the U.S. if it were invaded. I mean, Senator Beam has just talked about how Canada supported the United States. You have international leaders calling for the president to apologize for what he said about troops in Afghanistan. Why would he make these claims?
You know, the president will use this kind of platform and these kind of claims to promote a political agenda and to make a political point. And the veracity of what he says is not important. What matters is the larger point he's trying to make, especially to the American public. And he's trying to diminish the role of allies and alliances, because he's stepping away from nearly 80 years of an alliance-based foreign policy and understanding the world differently. And he doesn't want to be hobbled by any obligations that he believes were created by historic commitments to the United States. And we know well Canada's role, for instance, in Afghanistan. We know the number of Canadian troops who were killed, many who were from Quebec. And we understand the importance of the role they played in many moments of American peril. But the president doesn't want to dwell on that because he sees the world very differently.
Senator Beam, the Globe and Mail reported this week that Canada has done military modeling to look at how Canada's armed forces would respond to a U.S. invasion. Now, I think it's very important to say that there is wide agreement that that is highly unlikely. But the mere fact that this is apparently taking place, according to sources cited by the Globe and Mail, what do you think that tells us about the state of this relationship right now?
It tells me that I'm very glad that I'm not reading classified documents anymore. But it does say that we have to be ready for any eventuality. And our particular vulnerability is in the Arctic. And that's why the Greenland question is so important. In the Senate, we did a study on Arctic security 2 years ago. And there are all kinds of issues that are related from permafrost affecting landing strips to climate change, making the straits more navigable, tourism, adventure tourism, search and rescue, and having increasing links with Greenland across the straits. So there's much that we need to look at and be prepared for, and that includes the possibility of some sort of aggression.
What's the single most important thing, Ambassador, that Canada can do to help itself in this moment?
Well, it's important to have a national conversation in which Canada makes clear to the United States that Canada is a partner that would love to continue this partnership, but that it requires a willingness on the part of the United States. And I believe in this regard, the U.S. Congress could be an important ally, because as fractious as that Congress is right now and as complicated as it is, I believe that there are any number of senators, representatives from across the United States, especially the northern states, who understand and recognize the importance of this. And so I think it's important for the Canadian government and the Canadian people to look for ways to reach beyond the executive branch in the White House and begin communicating with the American body politic through its representatives and directly, that this is a relationship that was built across centuries and is too valuable not to preserve.
Let me just add to what Tom said, and that is that there is a lot of this going on. Wherever we meet internationally, the Canadian and U.S. legislators are in contact and they are in discussion. So that is a very helpful element.
Thank you both so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Former U.S. Undersecretary of State Tom Shannon and Canadian Senator Peter Beam. In a sign of how fast the political world has been spinning, the week began with Trump warning the world would soon find out how far he'd be willing to go to acquire Greenland. Then the president claimed he'd secured a framework of a deal, putting an end, for now, to the escalating standoff between the U.S. and Europe. Many Republicans endorsed Trump's Greenland ambitions, even if it spelled the end of NATO. What does that tell us about whether the president's own party will ever push back? Jeff Flake is a former Republican senator for Arizona who frequently took on Trump during the president's first term. When Flake stepped down from the Senate, he urged his colleagues not to surrender to Trumpism.
We must never adjust to the present coarseness of our national dialogue with the tone set at the top. We must never regard as normal the regular and casual undermining of our democratic norms and ideals.
To find out what he makes of this moment, I spoke to Jeff Flake on Thursday. Welcome to the House.
Hello.
When you see Donald Trump's desire for the U.S. to possess Greenland, what do you believe is driving this?
Well, I think he wants a legacy that's tangible, and adding something of that size would put him in the category of just a few presidents. So I think that's it more than anything. Certainly there's security issues that everyone is concerned about, but those can be addressed without ownership.
Some of your former Republican colleagues have spoken out against Trump's designs on Greenland. Senator Tom Tillis said it would be bad for America and its allies, but good for Putin and other adversaries. Don Bacon of Nebraska said Trump's push for Greenland could lead to an impeachment investigation. At the same time, though, a significant number of Republicans did embrace this moment. We even saw some of them cutting up a cake shaped like Greenland with an American flag on it. I wonder what lesson you draw from this episode about whether the Republicans are ever likely to be a meaningful check on Trump.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is, you have to look at the congressional calendar coming up and look at the filing deadlines. As soon as Republicans are assured that they don't have a primary campaign, that the president can get in against them, they'll speak out a little more. So I haven't seen any Republicans come out in favor of invading Greenland. That's, I think, an 86% no issue. But they have, gone along with certainly the president just invoking tough rhetoric. And they won't challenge him unless they have to. And that is just the way our politics are right now. But when push comes to shove, and if President Trump made any designs, which he claims that he won't, on invading Greenland, you won't have Republicans push back until then.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is just how far, he has to actually invade another country, essentially, for them to speak up?
I think that most Republicans knew what has already happened, that Europe at some point said that's enough. We'll stand up. We can only be pushed so far. Here's a red line in terms of, sanctions being imposed, and they were countervailing sanctions that would be imposed on the U.S. Then the stock market tanked 800 points, and the president changed his view the next day. If anything comes around to hurt the U.S. economy significantly, the president knows that that's significant during the next elections, the midterm elections coming up. So that's more important to him right now.
So is it fair to say that the stock market is a better check on Donald Trump than the Republican Party right now?
No doubt. No doubt. Yes. I mean, there are certain Republicans who are retiring and others who, once we pass the filing deadline, will feel a little more free. But Republicans in Congress have not been a significant check.
What would your message be to them right now, those folks that you're hoping, as you put it, feel a bit more free?
Well, I understand where they are politically. I think they know that up to now, the president can pick any Republican primary in the country and take a Republican out. But there are certain things where you just have to stand up. And the U.S. invading a sovereign nation is one. And it's frustrated me that more haven't spoken out on this and some other issues.
So you're saying there's, in fact, literally a date we should be circling on our calendar. I'm not quite sure what that filing deadline is.
Well, it depends on the state. There are different filing deadlines for different states, and then when you come to the midterms, you'll see a different scenario completely. Every president in his second term is a lame duck after the midterm elections, and Donald Trump is no different.
He is so different, I guess, is what I wonder as you say this. Everything about him has been so different. So why would we expect these norms to apply to him?
Well, he's not going to be on the ballot, and those who have tried to imitate him have not done well. If you take my state of Arizona, it's still a red state, but we have two Democratic senators, a Democratic governor, Democratic attorney general, Democrat secretary of state. All the top offices are held by Democrats because Republicans running have tried to imitate the president and have done very poorly. And I think that most in the party recognize that. And the president, regardless of what he said, is going to lose a lot of sway at the midterms and even before.
You have been saying for years that there is you call it a fever in American politics, and particularly in your party. And you've said over and over again for about a decade now, the fever will break. Trumpism, though, has had the Republican Party in its grasp for all of that time. What if this is a chronic condition rather than a flare-up?
It has lasted longer than I expected or wanted, certainly, but it has its end. In the end, grievance and anger are not a governing philosophy. At some point, you have to govern, and Republicans know that. If you look at most of my former colleagues, there have been a few elected more recently that are true believers, but by and large, all of them know that tariffs are inflationary, that protectionism makes every country poorer, particularly the United States. Some of these are Republican articles of faith, conservative articles of faith that we know that we have to govern with in the end, and populism just kind of runs its course after a while, and it's about to.
Are you surprised, though, at how much
Yes.
your former colleagues then have been willing to hold their tongues?
Yes, I have. I have. I understand the desire to stay in office, but sometimes at what price? I would have liked to have served a second term in the U.S. Senate, but the price I would have had to pay was to say those principles I said I believed in, I no longer do, or that behavior I said I could condone, it's growing on me, and that simply wasn't worth it. So I've been a bit chagrined, surprised, but in the end, I think if nothing else, for survival or self-interest, you'll see a lot of Republicans migrating to previous positions.
I'd like to draw on another part of your experience here. You were also the ambassador to Turkey, a NATO member. Do you think that the military alliance came back from the brink this weekend when this framework for a deal over Greenland was achieved with Trump?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that framework, if it's really anything, but gratefully there is great support everywhere in the alliance, other than perhaps the United States right now. And NATO has been the most successful military alliance of all time. And those who are in it, I served in Turkey, the largest military outside of the U.S. in NATO, and there's still strong support for NATO. And so I think that it will survive, but it's difficult with, the U.S. as a chief architect pushing the other way sometimes.
Do you think this week and these recent months have shown us a fragility in NATO that we were perhaps unaware of?
I think that some of those fissures were shown earlier than now, but I think the fact that it's come back, European leaders this week stood firm. And I think that that's what led to, one, President Trump's retreat from this current position, is that, the Prime Minister of Canada, obviously that speech at Davos was a barn burner, and the president referenced it specifically. But the fact that European leaders were standing up, would have imposed their own sanctions on the U.S., convinced the president to back down. And so I think the strength of other members of NATO have certainly helped its survival.
You say the speech was a barn burner. The president has a different view, obviously. It angered him. Do you think that Mark Carney's speech will have any resonance beyond with Donald Trump in American politics?
I don't know. I hope it's a reminder to Americans, to elected officials, to Republicans in particular, the truth of that, the reference, the allegory basically to the signs in the shop window. This deviation, this rupture, as the Prime Minister called it, is serious. And like I said, almost all of my former colleagues in the Senate have aligned themselves with that view. And I think that they're far more comfortable with, the traditional beliefs that Republicans have had regarding foreign policy and military alliances.
Appreciate your time and your reflections today. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
former Republican U.S. Senator Jeff Flake. Lots more coming up on the House podcast. In a moment, Canada's International Trade Minister was in the room for Carney's speech. Whether it could change Canadian trade, that's in about 10 minutes. I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure to give us a follow so you never miss an episode. And tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca. Will Mark Carney's call for middle powers to work together translate into any action from European allies? Jorvan Bellman is the German ambassador to Canada. We spoke Friday. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Catherine, for having me.
There were lots of similarities between Mark Carney's speech and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's speech as well, also to the World Economic Forum. The Chancellor even nodded to the Prime Minister's speech in his speech. What do you think are the most important pieces of common ground?
First of all, I want to congratulate the Prime Minister. It was a truly remarkable speech, and I think very well received all over the world. Indeed, you're right. There were a lot of parallels in the messages. So the message that a new era has already begun, that, it's no use thinking about what we lost, but that we really have to get our act together, do our homework. So, and the Chancellor really stressed that, up our defenses, get our economies become more competitive, and really work together amongst allies is important. So also the notion that, democracies don't have subordinates. They have allies, trusted friends, partners, and really an appeal to not lose of all of that. I think if there is maybe a nuance or a bit of a difference in the speeches, it is that the Chancellor more actively also said, don't give up on NATO. These big alliances that we have with the US are still important. Trust has to be rebuilt, and that's the work ahead of us. But we shouldn't give up on them.
Is there a fear that people are giving up on NATO right now?
I don't think there is a fear in terms of collective action in that regard. But of course, in a lot of discussions you have, and a lot of discussions that are out there in the public realm, there is a notion of, where's all that headed if there is no trust amongst allies anymore?
Of fragility, yeah.
So I think there is some trust building that has to be done. But I think also that people have to be aware of, how far-reaching the consequences are if these alliances don't work anymore. And we have always believed, and the Chancellor actually said it in his speech, that the comparative advantage the US has vis-à-vis adversaries and competitors is really this network of allies and trusted allies and partnerships.
And of course, the fundamental question of these speeches is, I guess, the extent to which the trust is still there. Chancellor Merz also said in his speech, a world where only power counts is a dangerous place, adding, I do not say this lightly. In the 20th century, my country, Germany, went down this road to its bitter end. It pulled the world into a black abyss. It's a chilling warning. The Chancellor believes this moment warrants it.
I think, we are a country that in many respects is, on the one hand, a symbol of what positive US power can do. I mean, we came back to the world of democracies. We came back to economic welfare largely because we had US support, and we will be forever grateful for that. But I think what he really tried to say is a world in which only power counts, and we see it, of course, in the war in Ukraine every day. If this spreads, that's really a dangerous moment in history, and we should do everything we can to prevent that.
One of the clear points of agreement where the Chancellor quoted Mark Carney was about recognizing the value of our power. Beyond more trade, what is one way the value of the power of middle powers can be deployed?
I think you saw during the last week that in the end we were able to overcome the dissent on Greenland and territorial integrity and sovereignty by a mix of two things. On the one hand, I think the message from the European countries and others was very clear that if we are going to be tariffed over defending these fundamental principles that we all share, our answer will be measured but firm, and it will come. And at the same time, really an outreach to try and get the conversation back into where it belongs, into meeting rooms, and not, to be led via microphones. So I think that was very important. The kind of leverage that we have is, we have fiscal leverage, we have trade leverage, we have regulatory leverage. So it's not that just because we're not superpowers, we have no power at all. But of course, we need to coordinate. And we also need to be honest about those aspects where the US rightly criticize us for, not doing our homework in terms of defense and stuff like that. I think a lot has happened since then. All of us are stepping up and are investing much more into our defenses. So it's a mix really of all these.
Is there a desire to see Canada participate going forward in some of that economic leverage that you talked about? Right now, we feel that perhaps the Greenland situation has come back from the brink, remains to be seen, I suppose. But it seems entirely possible that there will be other moments of confrontation. Would having Canada as a part of that response be helpful?
Sure, of course. I mean, Canada is a G7 country, and you're an important country, and we have very tight political relations with you. So I can see that in many areas. I still believe we all have a joint interest in keeping our alliances with the US running as well. So I don't want this to be understood as a ganging up or something like that. But I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of a lot of these areas to coordinate more. We see in the defense realm how Canada is now the only non-European country that is part of the SAFE instrument. So that's a good step in that area. We have sort of minilateral cooperations in the defense area under NATO with Canada in terms of maritime security. We would, of course, like to expand that in terms of the submarine procurement and really set up a very powerful tripartite coalition in that regard that builds and maintains and sustains together. And there are other areas as well. I mean, in terms of the Prime Minister often talks about, and other members of the government here, about seeing how the different free trade agreements we have can be brought to bear more. And I think regulation is a prime example of where you can actually achieve a lot when you coordinate.
You talked about defense. One other comment by the U.S. president that is getting a lot of attention is his suggestion this week to Fox News that international troops didn't do the tough work in Afghanistan, that it was only American troops doing the hardest work. The UK's Prime Minister has said those remarks are insulting and frankly appalling. He's suggesting Trump should apologize. Germany was also a major contributor to international forces in Afghanistan. Dozens of German soldiers died. What is Germany's response to Trump's remarks?
Yeah, of course, the remarks like these are painful. They're painful for the families who have lost loved ones who went to war in order to honor our alliances. And let's not forget that it was, September 11th and everything that came after that made all of us engage militarily in these out-of-area missions. So I don't think it's helpful, and I hope that we can come back to a conversation where we honor the price all of us have paid, and certainly those who've paid the ultimate price and fell.
Ambassador, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
German Ambassador Thorvin Bellman. It's been just over a week since Prime Minister Mark Carney secured a trade deal in China. How much did the government consider possible retaliation from the U.S.? Maninder Sidhu is Canada's Minister of International Trade. He was with the Prime Minister both in China and in Davos, and he joined me from the cabinet retreat in Quebec City on Friday. Minister, welcome back to the House.
Thanks for having me on, Catherine.
I do very much want to talk about some of the deals Canada is working on with other countries, but I do think we need to start with that Davos speech. In it, the Prime Minister talked about countries not perpetuating lies they know to be true, stop pretending, name reality. What is one thing Canada will do differently now to be more clear about this path that Mark Carney laid out?
Yeah, well, look, I was in the room during that speech, and what an empowering moment for Canada. I got messages from all around the world from different folks, even in Canada, from people from different political walks of life, and everybody was excited about that speech because it really resonated with Canadians in terms of empowerment, in terms of what Canada stands for, our principles. a middle power with lots of convening power. And so that speech was definitely inspirational for many, many Canadians, including myself. If you look at the standing ovation, three people historically have got standing ovations in that room: Nelson Mandela, Vladimir Zelensky, and of course our Prime Minister Mark Carney. And so I think that speech has really empowered Canadians that we need to believe in our principles. We need to stand together, but we also need to come together with countries around the world to work together and collaborate instead of isolation.
But concretely, what is one thing Canada is going to do differently now or needs to do because Mark Carney has put out this call?
Yeah, I think pragmatism, came through loud and clear. We need to look at the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, as the Prime Minister said. And so you need to meet the moment. And the moment for Canada is to ensure that we're bringing opportunities for Canadians. Of course, you can have those difficult and hard conversations. The Prime Minister was very clear. Are we going to agree with every single nation that we work with? Probably not. I mean, even with your own neighbor, you have disagreements, but at the end of the day, you can work through those issues by having dialogue, by having conversations. And I think the speech was about being pragmatic in our approach to the world.
Okay, so more, it sounds like an approach than specific actions. I wonder, though, when it comes to the specifics, you talk about all the people who reached out to you after the speech. Did it make anyone more interested in trading with Canada or investing with Canada? Did anything concrete come of it in that way?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. And coming back to Davos, we had met with a lot of global CEOs, industry leaders, experts. Every single one of them said Canada presents the certainty for opportunities. Every single one of them said Canada's a reliable, stable trading partner. And so I sat down with pharmaceutical giants. I sat down with Glencore, which is a Swiss mining company that employs over 12,000 employees in 4 different provinces: Siemens, Atkins Realis. And so all of them want to do more with Canada, within Canada. And so this is a conversation that we're having, but you need to be there at the table to have those conversations, to pitch Canada. And so we should be proud of what we have. We have the most educated workforce in the world. We're globally connected with 15 trade agreements with 51 countries, access to 1.5 billion consumers. We're building big things with our major projects office in energy, in mining, in trade infrastructure, and we're reliable and stable. And
I think I'm getting the pitch that those businesses just got, sir. Listen.
No, but I think it's very important for Canadians to see this because we have a lot to be proud of. And at a time when there's so much instability in the world, Canada has so much to offer. And you've heard the Prime Minister say this over and over again. Canada has what the world wants, and we need to be there to pitch it.
Well, part of this equation, though, is, of course, the reaction of President Trump to Mark Carney's speech. Let's listen.
Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
That last bit, remember that next time. Do you read that as a threat?
Well, when I look at the U.S. and when I think about the U.S., there'll always be an important trading partner to Canada. Our geography is not going to change for as far as I know. But my job as the international trade minister is to really focus on diversification. For the longest time, 25 years ago, 90% of our trade went to the U.S.
Minister, that is distinctly not an answer to the question of whether or not Donald Trump threatened us.
No, but I think, look, when you look at, I get it where maybe Mr. Trump is coming from, but, we control what we control. We don't control what our southern neighbors do, right? And the Prime Minister has been very, very clear about this, that, we can give ourselves more than any foreign power can take away. And
right,
so,
but you also have to assess what he's doing, and you're at this cabinet retreat. I understand that some of those conversations are privileged, but is the view that we are in Donald Trump's line of sight more because of that speech?
I think the view is our economic security is under threat, and we need to be able to move quick to secure new trading partners to diversify our trade. I think Canadians understand that, and that's what we'll continue to focus on. You look at our major projects office, what we're doing there. You look at what we're doing to protect our borders, our country, our communities. 1,000 more CBSA officers, 1,000 more RCMP officers. Record level investments in defense. We haven't invested this much since the 1950s in defense. And so if you look at what we are doing, yes, of course, our economic security is at stake. Our largest trading partner has increased tariffs in many different industries. And so we need to be able to diversify. And I think Canadians understand that.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick seemed angry about Canada's work with China. He told Bloomberg that if Canada continues going to China, saying we will open markets to China and Chinese EVs, that Donald Trump may not want to maintain CUSMA as it is. You worked on this deal with China. When you were doing that, did you take any pause because of the idea of U.S. retribution?
Look, the deal with China, I mean, why is China important? Second largest trading partner. We were hit with canola tariffs quite large that stopped our shipments from going there many, many months ago. And so for the longest time, Canada didn't engage with China, through our Joint Economic Trade Commission. That's the first thing I want to get going. It sat dormant for about 8 years, Catherine. And so you need to have dialogue. You need to be able to have conversations. And so from when that conversation started in May to the agreement that we got in recent weeks is a win for Canada. That gives us access to, our agriculture industry, $7 billion of access.
I want to get more into the deal in a minute, sir, but I do want to stay with this question. When you were plotting this out with other Canadian officials, did you say to yourselves, this might tick off the Americans, but I presume you decided it was worth it because you went ahead?
At the end of the day, we're going to do what's best for Canada, for Canadian workers, for our industries. And I think that's very important to mention here. Look, who doesn't trade with China? I think that's very important. China powers the global economy. You need to be able to work with China, and that's exactly what we're doing.
On the deal itself, among the businesses it's supposed to help, there is some anxiety, I think, about how durable the deal is. China has only agreed to relax tariffs until the end of the year. There is some confusion, I'll say, about what is included, what isn't. For instance, pork, lobster. The deal's time limited. Is this really a deal for the long haul with China?
Look, I think it provides stability and certainty for now. I mean, I met with the canola sector. They wanted our canola to flow that way. It's a big market. It's an important market for them. And so resolving that was very important. That's why you saw Premier Mo on that trip in China. He was there on the ground. And so, resolving that dispute, if you look at the seafood sector, this is huge for those in Eastern Canada, including many of those fishermen on the ground. But also, if you look at what else there is, it's about beef access that hasn't had access in many, many years. And so if you look beyond agriculture and seafood, it's about consumer goods. It's about electric vehicles. I'm an Ontario MP, as you know, Catherine. In my riding, Stellantis plant has laid off 3,000 people. And I've talked to many of those workers that they just want to work. They want to build cars. They don't care who they build for. They just want to build cars. And so we need to be able to attract investments to this country. And so part of that is hopefully joint ventures between Canadian and Chinese company to build those vehicles here.
And yet your Premier, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, says they're spy cars. How does that sit with you?
Look, I think it's important if you look at what this means for Canadians. It means more affordable vehicles. In fact, in year one, 49,000.
They need to be secure, though, too, obviously.
Absolutely, and there can be joint ventures with Canadian partners to make sure that they're secure. Many of the Teslas that are on Canadian roads are built in China, and your appliances that you use at home built in China. And so I think we need to be eyes wide open. Of course, it's important that we respect the privacy of Canadians, and so we'll continue doing that. But at the same time, we also need to be able to work economically and collaborate with countries and bring those opportunities here. And from my private sector experience, Catherine, I think it's important to note that most people wouldn't deploy billions of dollars in new manufacturing until they understand the market. And how would they understand the market is if you give them a taste of the market. And so 49,000 vehicles represents less than 3% of total production. And I think it's important for Canadians to have that option.
Okay. Thank you, Minister.
Thanks, Catherine. Take care.
International Trade Minister Maninder Sidhu. Carney's speech in Davos also made waves here in Canada. It even got a nod from an unlikely source, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre.
Prime Minister Carney's well-crafted and eloquently delivered speech at Davos has been widely noted, and I want to start by offering my own praise. The Prime Minister is right to restate what many have said for years. Canada must become more self-reliant, less dependent, and work with like-minded countries to advance our interests.
There is definitely a but, though, as Poilievre called on Carney to deliver results, not just speeches.
What stood out most to me was when he pointed out, quote, the gaps between rhetoric and reality. That's especially true here at home. If liberal words and good intentions were tradable commodities, Canada would already be the richest nation on earth. Unfortunately, after a decade of promises and grand speeches, Liberals have made our economy costly and dependent, more so than ever.
So, did the Liberals' cabinet retreat in Quebec City this week give any clues to their next steps? Aaron Wherry is a senior writer with CBC's Parliamentary Bureau. Aaron, welcome back to the House.
Happy to be here.
Carney kickstarted this cabinet retreat with another speech, this time aimed at a domestic audience. What did it tell us about the government's focus as MPs prepare to return to the House of Commons?
Yeah, I think the second speech was meant to kind of rally Canadians or give them something to rally around. He tried to define, I think, the values that he thinks define Canada, ground the government's agenda in those values, and maybe reassure some Canadians who are maybe sort of doubting or questioning the government's commitment to some values, some progressive values, reconciliation, climate change.
He talked about social programs that were sort of Trudeau-era social programs, dental care as being sort of an important, even fundamental thing.
Yeah, and I think tried to place that in some kind of larger arc about both Canada and Canada's place in the world. This idea that Canada can be a beacon to the world at this point in time. I think, there were hints of things to come in terms of an artificial intelligence strategy, continued focus on affordability. But I think it was more about, placing the government's broader agenda, the things that it's trying to do already in terms of, major projects, in terms of defense, in terms of trade, in terms of what's going on in the world and what I guess he had talked about in Davos.
The where was significant too. The cabinet retreat was in Quebec City, and the speech really did talk a lot about the idea of national unity, what brings Canadians together. But this is where there was some significant pushback to the speech. The Parti Québécois leader, who polls suggest could very well win the next election and has promised to trigger a referendum on sovereignty in Quebec, said that Carney was lying about our history, talked about deforming it. He said he's going to give a point-by-point response to Carney on Sunday. So some blowback there that perhaps the Prime Minister didn't anticipate.
Yeah, I think there is an undercurrent within that speech of national unity, and I think that's something that is going to be a concern in the next 12 months. And so I think, any blowback in that respect is something, Mark Carney's going to have to think about.
One other thing that I do want to mention, both at this cabinet retreat, also while he was in Davos, the Prime Minister hasn't taken questions for several days now from reporters. And there are a lot of pressing issues that I think many Canadians would like to hear a bit more about.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of follow-up questions to, in particular, that speech in Davos. And I think there are, when he talks about sort of living the truth and acknowledging what's going on in the world, you look at just the last 24 hours, we've had Donald Trump's comments about NATO's contribution to the war in Afghanistan. You've had Scott Bessent, a member of Trump's cabinet, talking about the potential of an Alberta referendum. I think those are things that you would like to see the Prime Minister asked about and talk about. And I guess hopefully there is an opportunity to do that soon enough.
Now, we played those clips from Pierre Poilievre at the beginning. He had some kind words about Carney's speech in Davos, but he's arguing that there aren't any actions to back up Carney's talk. He also said the reality is many Canadians' jobs depend on the United States. What do you think was Poilievre's strategy?
I think Pierre Poilievre's trying to do a few things. One is to undercut the Prime Minister's claim to be handling what's going on in the world, to raise some questions about how well Mark Carney's doing on that front. And then I think the second piece of it is to really ground the conservative criticism of the government in domestic issues, in affordability, in resource development, in defense spending and getting things done. I think it's also, placing it within a larger argument that Pierre Poilievre had made against the Trudeau government, which is that it's more talk than action, that it's lots of lovely words, but it's not living up to those words. I think there's also an interesting piece, and I think it'll be interesting to see how it develops over the next 12 months about exactly what our relationship is to the United States and what exactly that's going to look like. But it's a bit too soon yet, I think, to see exactly where the parties are going to line up on that.
It's also interesting because I think it's a very purposeful strategy on the part of the Conservatives to show some support for where the Canadian government is on some of these national issues, where there is by and large unity, be it Greenland or just more broadly NATO alliance, etc., but still offer a critique, a sort of impatience to get to some results.
Yeah, I think there's always a bit of a challenge for an official opposition in a situation like this because you don't want to be looking like you're undercutting the government undercutting the country. So you have to sort of express disappointment more than criticism. But I suspect
I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think as time goes on, I think that if there are openings where it seems like Mark Carney has put a foot wrong, I suspect the Conservatives will not hesitate to point it out.
I see that bold prediction you made there, Aaron. I think it may well be true. What else are you watching for when Parliament returns next week?
So I think it's useful to remember that it may seem like ancient history now, but when MPs were last in Ottawa, we were talking about floor crossing, the potential for floor crossers.
Michael Maw going to the Conservative Christmas party and then the Liberal Christmas party the next night when he crossed the floor.
Exactly,
yeah.
that neat trick. And of course, he was the second MP after Chris D'Entremont earlier in the fall. And so I think, we, to a certain extent, go back on floor crossing watch to see whether someone else potentially leaves. And I think the other thing, of course, is that Pierre Poilievre is facing a leadership review vote next weekend.
The House is going to be there in Calgary covering it all.
So I think that hangs over at least the first week. And then I think going forward, it's about how is the government's agenda both being implemented and getting through Parliament. Because the other thing that hangs over this, of course, is that we are in a minority parliament. And if legislation's not moving, I think that, increases the likelihood or possibility, at least, of an election.
Lots to watch for. Our jobs are never dull. Thank you so much for this, Aaron.
Anytime.
The CBC's Aaron Wherry. Okay, that is it for us this week. Our crew on the House is Kristen Everson, Emma Godmere, Benjamin Lopez-Steven, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plant. I'm Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.